Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Crisis Calm Surgery. This session is part of a special series to help you prepare for tomorrow. Please visit our website for recordings of our first webinar and to sign up for future sessions. My name is Terry Jang, and I will be the moderator for today. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items regarding today's presentation. This is a live presentation through Zoom, so you may experience a slight delay as we click between slides. Our presentation will last approximately 30 minutes with some time for questions at the end. We'll have a recording of today's webinar available. In a few days' time, you will receive an email with a link to the recording. All attendees will be muted during today's event to cut down on any background noise, but we do welcome your questions. Please submit your questions via the Q&A button found at the top of your screen, and we will address as many as we can, time permitting. We will end the presentation with a question and answer session. During today's Crisis Calm Surgery, we will be asking you questions through our anonymous polling tool. This will help you determine to what extent your company is prepared for a crisis. Please keep pen and paper handy so you can write down your score. Also, you can follow the conversation on Twitter using hashtag IAT and following us at Team Lewis Global. A little bit about Lewis and who we are. We're a global integrated communications agency providing full PR, marketing, and digital services with 30 offices across the globe. You can find out more by visiting us at teamlewis.com. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. First up, we have Dan Masser. Dan is a strategic communications and reputation management specialist and heads of Lewis's corporate comms practice. He has vast experience helping companies handle a range of challenges from corporate repositioning and stakeholder advocacy to creative campaigning and issues and crisis management. And next, we have Gugs Sarna. Gugs brings over 12 years digital marketing experience to her role as the head of Lewis Pulse UK. She provides strategic counsel and digital recommendations for fully integrated campaigns. Her experience covers a wide breadth of digital services, including organic and paid social media, SEO and SEM, digital marketing initiatives related to demand and lead generation, online influencer activities, and crisis support. With that, I will pass the presentation over to Dan.
Great, thank you very much, Terry, and a pleasure to be speaking to you all today. So we thought the best place to start would actually be to talk about what a crisis looks like. Well, a crisis, by its strict definition, is something which is a long-term threat to reputation or ability to operate. A crisis can come out of the blue, or it might be an issue that suddenly escalates. And what makes a crisis a mega crisis? Well, the clue is on the screen with VW, the answer being a cover-up. Something was known internally, it was covered up, and it came out, and that can make a crisis all the more serious. However, no matter the scale of the crisis, it's likely that they will feature many of the characteristics that you see on screen here. So, in a crisis, events move quickly and at speed, and because of that, it's difficult quite often to maintain control. That in itself is hampered by the fact that stakeholders, both internal and external, are asking for information, providing information. You might not always know the answers, but people will be coming to you, and there's a danger that information can slip between the cracks. That leads to confusion and stress. There's also, of course, a fair degree of uncertainty, and crises can be costly in terms of resources, people, market share, and reputation. However, looking at the next slide, we know that actually it's not all bad news. So what you see here is some research undertaken by an organization called Oxford Metrica a few years ago. And they looked at how organizations come out of a crisis. So you've got share price on the left and number of days along the bottom. And you can see quite clearly here that companies which experience a crisis in the aftermath fall into two buckets: the recoverers and the non-recoverers. And the question therefore is for us, what are the factors that lead to a company landing on the right side, that blue line on top? Well, there are a few key factors. First one I'd say is the importance of having goodwill in the bank. So something to insulate you when a crisis hits. This is important. So do you know who your stakeholders are? Do they know you? Do they know what you stand for as an organization, what you give back to society, what you do perhaps to reduce risk? Other factors are having a clear and efficient response, the quality of leadership, the ability to balance reputational considerations with operational actions. And all of these factors are what we're going to concentrate on today. So when we look at the agenda for the rest of today's session, there are three key parts that Gugs and I are going to talk through. The first is around strategy. So the ability to put reputation at the heart of a crisis response and in day-to-day operations to mitigate the chance of a crisis arising. The second area is engagement. So when a crisis hits, knowing who to talk to, when to talk to, and how to do it. And the third part is something we've termed muscle memory. So you're in crisis mode. Do you have the instinctive knowledge to operate as a company, both efficiently and effectively? Not just as a crisis comms team, but as a crisis management team. So thinking about all of the senior management who would form that team. As Terry said, there will be a voting mechanism. So what we will do is we will provide our version of best practice of each of those three areas, and we will ask you to benchmark yourselves. That's, in a sort of loose sense, why we're calling it a crisis comms surgery. You get the opportunity to self-diagnose. The benchmarking best practice is the prescription if indeed you feel there are any weaknesses that need to be addressed. That's as far as we're going to take the overly convoluted healthcare metaphor. So with that, we're going to go into the first chapter, which is all about having a reputation-based strategy in a crisis. So quite often in a crisis situation, you can sometimes see the push and the pull, if you like, between communications on the one hand and legal and operations on the other. And an overly legalistic or operational response has its dangers. And I say that because reputation must be seen as an asset. Now, I'm sure you know this, but reputation leads to increased trust from the audiences that matter. That eventually leads to growth and differentiation. And given the amount of time it can take to build up reputation, it's not something that you want to put at risk. It's said that reputation arrives on foot and leaves on horseback. So as comms and marketing people, we and you are the reputation experts within an organization. You must therefore make sure that the voice of communications is heard, not only in a crisis, but in day-to-day business operations. In a crisis, though, the first thing that the board might ask of the communications team is, what do we say? And it's not always easy for communications to answer that. And that's because in a crisis, especially at the start of a crisis, quite often little is known. There's just a fair amount of speculation. However, you may feel as though you need to say something, because if you don't, it might give the impression that you don't care or you're guilty of something. So when you don't know the facts, but you need to say something, what do you say? Well, there's a crisis communications mantra known as the 3 C's, and it looks like this. It's concern, control, and commitment. So in the example we've given here, you might be expressing concern for those affected and their families. There's an important distinction to be made between saying, we were concerned to hear of this and we're sorry for it. If you say you're sorry, you might be opening yourself up to legal liabilities, but you've got to strike the right balance depending on the nature of the crisis. Second element is to demonstrate control. So this is what we are doing at the most senior level. The third element is commitment. We're committed to do whatever we can to help, to work with the relevant authorities, to find out exactly what happened. And sometimes there's a fourth C as well, which is context. We're a company that's been operating for decades, and never before has anything like this happened. So a useful framework to bear in mind. And of course, every crisis is different, but it's something that may serve you well should you need it. So having asked, what do we say? The next question from your board or senior management might be, to safeguard our reputation, what do we do? Now, as I say, every situation is different, but there are some guiding principles that are most definitely worth being aware of. And they look like this. The first is to take control and act quickly. Gugs will talk more about the importance of this in terms of social media, but it's said that within a crisis, there's a golden hour that a company's got to act quickly and get its message across. A decision needs to be made about whether you raise your head above the parapet. Would a company going out with a message inflame the situation? Or is it a case that actually, yes, you need to say something to demonstrate concern? It's a judgment call. Secondly, there's a need to stick to the facts. Thirdly, you need to stick to the facts, and then also consider all internal and external audiences. So if, for example, if we're talking about a data breach, who are the regulators that you might need to inform? Who's going to inform them? What does that cascade look like? Who are the influencers? Again, the Gugs is going to discuss that. So certainly we need to think beyond customers and staff. Who are we going to talk to and how? Yes, there's the need to be transparent and communicate the 3 C's. Learning from mistakes sounds obvious, but isn't something that's always something that always happens. We'll think about an example later of where a company that didn't do that. And the final guiding principle we'd say is, I'd possibly say one of the most important, if not the most important, is to think through, in the start of a crisis, what are your reputational objectives? And so, as I'm sure you know, reputation hinges on perceptions. Therefore, we need to think, how do we want to be seen? Do we want to be seen as transparent, caring, fast acting? Whatever it may be, is something that needs to be decided early on. So if we look at the next slide, which is a sample agenda for a crisis communications team meeting. Yes, there's the importance of deciding who is doing what and to summarize what we know. But third there on the agenda, you see this imperative to agree reputational objectives. Even if it means just getting it up on a flip chart, then by looking at it and we're always referring back to it, we can keep ourselves honest. Are the words that we are using and are the actions that we are undertaking furthering those reputational objectives? And if they're not, we should be asking ourselves, should we be saying this? Should we be doing this? And actually, it sounds really obvious, but quite often companies don't do this. I mean, for example, if United Airlines had undertaken such an exercise, maybe their response wouldn't have been as it was. So if we go to the next slide, please, Gugs, thank you. I'm sure you all know exactly what happened with United Airlines and the passenger that was filmed being dragged off the plane. So I won't go into the details, but you know, United Airlines have thought through those reputational objectives and adhered to more of those best practice principles, and surely they wouldn't have been in the mess they were. So, for example, they didn't act fast. That first guiding principle of crisis communications. Social media got ahead of them before they were able to get their message across, and that speaks to the need for a social media plan, which sets out who the decision makers are, who's going to implement the updates, which communication channels will use, what to do if the key players are away. Did they have that? Have you got that? I'm not sure, but clearly it's absolutely vital. Secondly, they didn't communicate the 3 C's. Instead, as I'm sure you'll remember, the quote from the CEO was, "I apologize for having to reaccommodate these customers." No empathy, which in itself is crucial in delivering the right tone for the 3 C's. Surely he should have said, this is an upsetting event, or perhaps even a devastating event. Nor did they consider the internal and the external. The internal communications note, which was leaked, talked about the passenger becoming disruptive and belligerent. And nor did they learn from their mistakes. Some of you might remember that just a couple of months earlier, they were criticized for what was known as Leggingsgate, when a 10-year-old girl wasn't allowed to wear leggings on a plane. And the quote at the time was, "United Airlines shall have the right to refuse passengers if they are not properly clothed via our contract of carriage." Doesn't really speak to a caring organization, and they replicated that language with their point around having to reaccommodate passengers. So all in all, they didn't think about the bigger reputational picture. And there's a wider point here that I'd just like to make, which is, I'm not entirely sure There are more crises now than there were in the past. But we seem so attuned to them, perhaps because of 24/7 media, perhaps because of social media. And actually, I think because of that, just to do the bare minimum, the tick in the box response, it's not good enough. I think to be truly seen as a company that cares, you really need to throw absolutely everything at it. So that might have been saying they would communicate new policies to staff, retrain them, do all they could to settle a lawsuit quickly. So a further point there, if you're considering your bigger reputational objectives, what can you do to throw everything at the situation to show that you care?
Great, thank you, Dan. So as mentioned earlier, we're conducting some quick polls to help self-diagnose how well prepared you are in a crisis. In total, there'll be 4 questions, and if you can give yourself a score between 1 and 5, where 1 is not at all and 5 is absolutely. The poll is totally anonymous, so please be as honest as possible. We'll disclose the averages at the end of the poll. So if you can keep a note of your own score for each question, you should get a score out of 20. And then at the end, we can tally them all up and give you an overall score. So you should be able to see the poll in front of you on your screen at the moment. So please just click the relevant score for each question and don't submit until you've answered all of the questions. So question 1, the team would consider reputational objectives in a crisis as opposed to being purely led by legal or operations. If you scroll down to question 2, your senior management understands the importance of delivering the 3 C's and would know how to strike the right tone. Question 3, reputation is factored into decisions about all business units and functional activities. And finally, question 4, there are structures, processes, and metrics to identify, prioritize, and mitigate reputational risks. So I'll just give you a couple of moments more to put in any final responses. And thank you. I've just ended the poll, and I just wanted to share the results quickly with you. So as you can see, the kind of most popular response to question 1 was number 4. In number 2, it's kind of in the middle at number 3. For the third question, people have rated it at number 4, and finally for question 4, the majority of you have rated that at question 3. Great, thank you. So just moving on to the second pillar of crisis preparedness, which is that of engagement. So here we will outline knowing who to talk to, when to talk to them, and how to do it. And as Dan mentioned, just with the element of time here, we're going to focus on social specifically. So when we look at the life cycle of a crisis, there are different stages that have alternative messages and different focus areas. There are a wide variety of audiences through the life cycle of a crisis, so that could be media or clients or customers or even specific influencers. The grey boxes on the diagram in front of you cover what's going on externally, and the white boxes cover what's happening internally within an organisation. So obviously at the start of it, at the start of a crisis, you can see there's a lot of rumour and speculation. Typically, you do get some social media buzz. Stakeholders begin to start asking questions. And this is actually the time for a brand to kind of make sure that their information is gathered, make sure that they're thinking about all of the scenarios that could happen, make sure that they switch on their monitoring capabilities. And we'll talk a little bit more about how important monitoring is a little bit later. And then also thinking about how they might want to brief both internal and external stakeholders. As a crisis unfolds, there's more likeliness that questions will be asked. Social tends to drive a lot of those questions, and it actually tends to push the conversation externally and often amplify weaknesses and also criticisms. So at the peak of a crisis event, you tend to get a lot of scrutiny from your stakeholders. You get significant media and social media engagement, and public reaction drives the agenda with stakeholders if there's no initial response that fails to satisfy the expectations. So this is really where a brand has to actively listen and inform and actually evolve their position and messaging, how to kind of really deal with a crisis, as well as knowing how and when to rebut. And then at the end of the crisis, looking at sort of the ongoing regulatory issues, the ongoing public inquiries, any other things that you need to kind of consider as you wind down. As a brand, this is where you can assess your reputational damage. This is where you can look to what you can learn from the incident as it's taken place, and actually what you can do moving forward. So to put some colour into this life cycle, we can take a look back at a crisis situation with a brand called TalkTalk. So they are a large telecoms company in the UK, actually one of the largest. And back in October 2015, they suffered a huge cyber attack. So similar to as you can see, when the cyber attack hit, the actual pattern of the crisis is quite similar to the slide before. So actually, in this incident, they had to notify its over 4 million customer base that their names, addresses, birth dates, credit cards, and bank details were all at risk. And they actually seemed, as a brand, to panic the same, to mirror the panic of their customers. So, for example, they shut down all of their websites rather than switching to a safe site which didn't have any sensitive data on it or anything else. The biggest issue here was that a lot of the customers only really found out about the hack through the media and not actually via TalkTalk themselves. So actually, when you look at that first spike, it's actually after TalkTalk has broken the news to the media, and then it kicked off widespread tweets by media, stakeholders, customers, and general public. So what you're then seeing is that naturally the customers are finding out a lot more. The brand was more focused on communicating to its customers via media rather than kind of using their social channels or communicating with them at all. They actually tended to ignore social at the beginning, in its entirety. They also failed to update the Information Commissioner's Office about the details of the hack, which obviously then created additional criticism and actually showed a weakness in the message that they were pushing out. The messaging overall seemed like they weren't in control. They didn't confirm or deny whether they had encrypted customer data, and there was no guidance to its customers, and they were really focused on what the business was doing rather than demonstrating any empathy with their customers. The main problem in this instance was that their channel planning was all wrong. The company had put its tired and exhausted CEO out in front of every single media that had requested an interview. So despite not being well prepared and having no clear message, and they only really noticed that it wasn't working well into the crisis when they changed tack and actually developed a video response where she could provide a much more polished reply. So you need to really act quickly to stop social from getting away from you. Keep on monitoring and assessing the situation and any turns it takes. Because naturally, as particular media houses, or for example, I know Mashable will be very familiar with a number of you, as particular influencers online start mentioning these issues, it tends to amplify and actually add fuel to the fire. So you need to continuously keep on monitoring. Flexible channel planning strategies are essential, making sure that you're thinking about all of the mediums for communication. So whether that's social media, TV, radio, even just those online websites and blogs as well. You must know when to communicate and also who to communicate with, based on an understanding of those influences and those and the people that are really the driving force behind it. So to give you some idea about the engagement process, so obviously we've talked a lot about monitoring the situation. So naturally, monitoring is imperative. You can't know what's going on and where it's happening without it. And actually, this helps you define what your plan and your channel strategy would be in relation to any crisis. So social expectations are very high. So you have to plan that strategy according to where your audiences are and where they're discussing the crisis. So even if you might not necessarily have an immediate message, if there's a huge amount of discussion on social media, it might just be worth being involved in that conversation to help you keep in control of the message and actually show that you're considering where people are engaging with your brand. So monitoring the situation obviously allows you to keep in control a little bit more and allows you to regularly manage your message. Keep calm and try to consider all outcomes and possibilities. So actually, when you're thinking about the plan, what's the worst case scenario? And actually, work backwards from there, because at least in any turn, you'll be able to manage it accordingly. As Dan mentioned, you're often able to identify areas of risk and potential crisis for your organization. So we'll talk about the preparedness of a crisis and actually being able to identify where there might be areas of risk. And naturally with this, you're able to then think about who the right stakeholders and influencers might be. So this doesn't necessarily just have to be media. So think more broadly about politicians, think tanks, organizations, industry experts, for example, that have a huge amount of influence in your industry. There's a need to be heard, but you must be effective with your messaging. So adapting it for the right platform. And providing, for example, like providing a link to a statement might not always be sensible on Twitter. So think about how it needs to be adapted for each of the different types of platforms that you're using. Make sure that you're considering all of your audiences. The big mistake that TalkTalk made was that they seemed to ignore its customers, which only really seemed to make the situation worse. And naturally, this runs into timing, like actually considering when the best time to reply is, and actually what the best tone of response is as well. And this is, thinking about how Dan talked about United and how they came across as not really being particularly empathetic or considerate towards their customers. Sometimes like you have to be sensitive and compassionate and human as a brand. If there's been a big mistake or crisis and you're liable for that, it's worth kind of considering that in your tone of your messaging. And as always, there's not really ever one set formula. You can't just use the same formula for the next crisis, but actually you can learn a lot from the past. And the more you learn from the past, allows you to be more adaptive the next time a crisis comes, if and when it should ever. So it's time for our second poll. Again, there'll be a series of 4 questions. Again, if you could just give yourselves a score between 1 and 5, where 1 is not at all and 5 is absolutely. Remember, this is totally anonymous and obviously only hit submit once you've answered all of the questions. So the poll should be in front of you now. Question 1, you have the right tools to monitor and analyze a crisis across all platforms. Question 2, you have undertaken influencer mapping to prioritize communications in a crisis, both online and offline. Question 3, you have confidence your team would know when and how to respond to a breaking social media crisis. And if you scroll down to question 4, in a crisis, the organization could quickly create and promote a wide variety of social media content, from tweets and infographics to video content. So I'll just give you a few more moments to respond. So any final responses, and I will just end the poll. Great, thank you. So just to quickly share the results, a slightly kind of mixed response this time. So question 1, the bulk is in the middle, at number 3. Influencer mapping, actually it's quite a split response. So Some people are at the not at all stage, and then the other half of the people are around the almost absolutely stage, which is definitely a good sign. In terms of confidence, so question 3, there's a everyone's around sort of about 3 to 4. And in question 4, about creating content, a lot or the bulk of the audience is around 2 and 3. Great. So I'll just pass on to Dan for the final section.
Okay, thank you, Gugs. The final section is muscle memory, and what do we mean by this? It's about escalation procedures. It's about knowing who does what, having the right templates, knowing roles and responsibilities, all to ensure that efficient and effective response, which is more likely, therefore, to help protect and maybe even promote your reputation in a crisis. Now, there's a lot going on behind the scenes within all that, but it's the person that's fronting it up that often comes to embody an organization in a crisis. And how this works out can vary. So we've got 3 examples here, which we've termed the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we'll start with the good, which is Sir Richard Branson. So 10 years ago, a Virgin train derailed in Cumbria, which is in northwest England. It was carrying 105 passengers, 4 crew, and was travelling at 95 miles an hour when it came off the tracks. Now, by some miracle, only 1 person died, though there were 30 serious injuries, and it was deemed later on that the accident was caused by faulty train points. And that was only deemed later. But what makes Virgin's crisis response fall into the category here of the good was all about the boss, Richard Branson. So he visited the site of the derailment as quickly as he could. He left his skiing holiday. He was there a matter of hours later. During his press conference at the new site, he said he regarded the driver as a hero. As he attempted to stop the train, he remained in his seat to try and ensure the safety of the passengers. He thanked local residents for their help, and just him being there demonstrated that concern of the 3 C's, all of which Virgin managed to express through words and actions and embodied through Richard Branson. Less so is Tony Hayward, and I'm sure many of you will remember this. Tony Hayward, the CEO of BP, and so at the height of the company's response to Deepwater Horizon, when the company was being criticized, he was asked what he would say to the people of Louisiana. His response: "We're sorry for the massive disruption it's caused people's lives. There's no one who wants this over more than I do. I would like my life back." The statement was particularly criticized given that 11 people died in the explosion that caused the spill, but this was just one in a series of gaffes. And it just sort of goes to show that the CEO isn't always the best spokesperson. You, of course, want to give the impression that the most senior levels of the company are managing a crisis. But this raises a question in itself for me. Can the CEO manage a crisis, and by that I mean the operational response, and at the same time front it up as the main spokesperson? Perhaps not, but all that has to be worked through and tested. And then we have our final CEO, or rather former CEO, Travis Kalanick, recently forced out of Uber. And it was a series of incidents that led to his removal, as I'm sure many of you will be aware of. But it all started with a blog from one of his former employees detailing sexual harassment and the culture that allowed that to fester within Uber. And maybe the point here is less about responding to a crisis and more about identifying, prioritizing, and mitigating threats to reputation. So how many companies have a risk register? Well, I'm sure lots do. But how many have a reputational risk register? Perhaps not so many. Something that's simply more than a click and a tick in a drop-down box in a spreadsheet and anticipates what audiences might feel and do should certain risks transpire. And we would say this is a crucial piece of crisis preparedness so that potential issues don't bubble up and rise to the surface. But if they do, if an issue does escalate into a crisis, or if a crisis comes out of the blue, then there needs to be that smoothly working machine operating behind the CEO or whomever the spokesperson may be. And that's where the muscle memory comes in. So what we have on the next slide is how a typical crisis management team might look. You've got the crisis management leader at the top. Underneath that person is a crisis coordinator, which is a chief of staff type role. CD is communications director, and all the rest are as you see. Now, not every role may be required. The crisis coordinator should be deciding that with clear escalation and call-out procedures. However, everyone needs to know what they're doing at the outset of a crisis, during a crisis, and during stand down. That means having a checklist of considerations at each phase. Not a list of actions, you must do this, but a list of considerations. So every crisis is different. And you might actually see this crisis management team operating on a number of levels. For example, on a global and markets basis. So some of you might work for a global HQ which has got market subsidiaries. Do those markets know what's expected of them of a crisis versus global? Would global take control? What's the role of the country team? What if there are time differences? All of that has to be worked through and understood before a crisis hits. Otherwise, there's potential for chaos and a mismanaged response. And next we see how a communications team, a crisis communications team, could conceivably look. So you've got the crisis, so you've got the communications director at the top with a crisis communications team coordinator underneath. And again, not every one of these roles might need to be filled, but in a certain situation, they might be. And again, having everyone know what's expected of them, should they be asked to fulfill a particular role, is hugely important. That takes a plan, and that takes practice. Now, digital comms, right in the middle of the screen, there's a particularly interesting one, because that could be split out even further. So it might be that you need a link person. On the next slide, please, Gugs. You might need a link person to link the social team to the crisis communications team. You might need someone whose job it is to translate longer form statements into 140 characters or less and respond to queries. You might need a creative developer, someone to prepare infographics, videos, for example. That person might be the team member who liaises with your ad buyers so you can ensure that whatever you produce is promoted through social. And as Gugs said, of course you need someone doing monitoring and analysis. Everyone needs to know what they're doing or the roles they might be asked to fulfill, and it might be that you need deputies as well. So how do you actually put this muscle memory in place? What do you need to make it happen? Well, there's a 4-stage process that you can see on the screen here. And depending on your strengths or how advanced you are, you might come into this process at different stages. But let's talk through each stage one by one very quickly. That first stage is the audit. So reviewing existing crisis plans if you have them. So are they up to date? Were they written a few years ago? Are they not as modern as they should be? You can do that by simply going through literature review, but also through a brief crisis health check, or what we would recommend is a full crisis resilience audit, actually speaking to everyone who might have a role and responsibility, understanding what's expected of them, understanding how systems work, what's going to work best, so that when you come to write the plan in stage 2, you've got the buy-in from your senior stakeholders. And when we think about writing a plan, there are different versions of this, and you've got to think what is going to work best for your organization. Do you have a full plan which incorporates crisis management, so the operational side, and also crisis communications, or do you have them separate? Might you need a digital crisis plan? Have you got an HR crisis plan? And if you haven't, or if you're not sure, surely communications, as the guardians of reputation, should be speaking to HR about that. You know, if volunteers are required to man relative response hotlines, do they understand next of kin procedures, for example, and how to speak to worried relatives? But what might a crisis plan actually look like? So if you're talking about one that covers both communications and operations, it might look something like this. So at the outset, a company would define its definition of a crisis and what a best practice responses look like and what's required of the teams. Then it comes to managing and escalating. So that might be where a traffic light system comes in place. Many companies use that to ensure an appropriate level of response. It might also be where those guidelines come in, which explain the role of the market versus the role of global. Then we have crisis management team and crisis communications team. And this is where you would have your role and responsibilities cheat sheet, what to consider for each person at different stages of a crisis. Then we get down to the supporting documents, so the likes of fast facts, templates, and agenda setting documents. Now, what this can't be is a huge tome. It can't be something that sits on a shelf gathering dust, or as an app which is never open. And the best way to ensure that happen is firstly to make sure it's a document that can be easily navigated, not too dense, and secondly to work with those who might have responsibilities in a crisis to embed the plan. And that's the third stage of this particular program. So that might be crisis media training for the spokesperson. It might be role-specific coaching, perhaps for the CEO or the communications director. And it might be desktop exercises as well. So a couple of weeks ago, I was in Brussels with a client. The crisis communications team was there. They had a new crisis plan. And through a series of escalating scenarios, we worked through that plan together. They had the plans open. And each person on that team then better understood their role and the roles of others that they would be working with. The fourth and final stage is a simulation. This is the really fun one, or fun one for the facilitators anyway, where there's 3 or 4 hours of the team being bombarded with inputs from social media to camera crews turning up. And that is really where you test the team to ensure that they have that muscle memory in place.
So just bringing you on to the last poll, as previously, there'll be a total of 4 questions. If you can give yourselves a score between 1 and 5, where 1 is not at all and 5 is absolutely. And again, it's all absolutely totally anonymous, so please be as honest as possible. Hopefully you've kept a tally of your scores, so we can talk about those just shortly. So the poll should be on screen now. Question 1, you have a crisis process and procedures that are well understood by all those that may have a role in managing a crisis. You scroll down to number 2, those with a role in a crisis have a specific responsibilities that are clearly laid out and well understood. Question 3, you have confidence in your senior management and communications team to efficiently and effectively manage a crisis. And finally, question 4, you have goodwill in the bank from your key stakeholders and you could potentially draw on in a crisis. So I'll just give you a few more moments to respond. And if you hit submit once you've answered all of your questions, and just remember to make a note of the answers that you've given. Okay, great. I'm just going to end the poll. And sharing results with you all. So question 1, the crisis processes and procedures. Again, a bit of a split room. So, you know, some of you are less prepared than others, but it seems that we do have a few that are well prepared. Responsibilities, I think, you know, that seems to be the weakness in the group at the moment. So majority of you answered at number 2. You have confidence in your senior management. That's great. I mean, it looks like the bulk of everybody has a lot of confidence in their senior management, which is fantastic. And then it also looks like a lot of you have goodwill in the bank as well. So question 4, the bulk of our respondents have answered at number 4. Great, thank you. I'll pass back to Dan.
Okay, thank you. So I've taken you through 3 areas there, and we have 3 main indicators for getting you through a crisis. First is reputation being factored into operational decision making before, during, and after a crisis. Secondly, we talked about effective monitoring leading to a thorough channel strategy that allows you to speak to the right people at the right time with the right message and the right tone. And finally, we talked about having an efficient and effective response through muscle memory. And having marked yourself out of 20 for each of those, you should have a final score out of 60, which you might have jotted down. And if you have, I would say that over 50 is good. Under 40 is not so good. And between 40 and 50 certainly means there's a bit of room for improvement. That now ends the sort of self-diagnosis element of the crisis comms surgery. I hope you found it both interesting and useful. And at that point, I'll hand back to Terry.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Gugs. Okay, we'll go ahead and take some time for questions now. Just a reminder, if you haven't done so already, please be sure to submit your questions by clicking the Q&A button at the top of your screen. Again, the Q&A button is at the top of your screen, and it looks like we do have a few questions that have come in. So let's get started. So the first question up is, the role of the head of communications can be difficult in a crisis. On the one hand, you're part of the crisis management team. On the other, you are managing your own team. How can you ensure you aren't spread too thinly?
Yeah, as well noted from those couple of organogram type slides, that the role of the communications director features on both the crisis management team and the crisis communications team. And I think there is a danger that because the crisis is of course linked to reputation, that the communications director tends to take control. But that's why within those organograms, we included the roles of team coordinators, both in the CMT and the CCT. That's that chief of staff type role, which brings things together. And if you have that in place on both teams, then it should mean that the communications director has got the bandwidth to provide strategic advice on the one hand, and also be the link between the senior management team and the crisis communications team. So feeding down agreed strategy and feeding up how the situation is evolving through monitoring, and also the recommendations of the crisis comms team. So I think for me, it's all about those chief of staff roles to ensure the crisis comms director isn't spread too thinly. I hope that helps.
Great. The second question we have is, what was the most recent crisis situation you advised on? Can you say?
I think typically in these situations, it's not really for advisors to go into great detail about their clients, but maybe Gugs, we can talk about it in a very generic sense. Was Gugs and I worked on something together fairly recently. So a few weeks ago, one of our clients was the subject of an undercover investigation by the BBC. Our client is a coffee shop, and a number of coffee shops were investigated for hygiene. And there were some not very pleasant findings, including the findings of bacteria on the ice that goes into the ice drinks, such as frappuccinos, which I'm sure you have. But I think what was interesting about this was that we advised our client to go above and beyond. So to try and demonstrate, as I'm sort of mentioned before, that they were throwing absolutely everything at the crisis, and that meant finding out quickly what happened. And so when the program aired 5 or 6 days later, the responses from the other two companies featured were, we will undertake an immediate investigation, and with that we will find out what happened. Whereas our client said, we've undertaken the investigation already. We did it over the weekend. We found out what went wrong, and we've made the changes. This won't happen again. So it's just a question, I think, of demonstrating that you need to throw absolutely everything at a crisis to show that you care.
And to add to that as well, when we were looking at the social response or the social fallout from the crisis, one of the things that we noticed is that the customers of the brand that we were representing actually, were really appreciative of the speedy response from the brand. And actually, we were like live monitoring during the broadcast of the program, and we were monitoring for the days in the run up and also subsequently for the next few days. And a lot of the social responses were appreciative of the speedy reaction to it, and just to kind of think about how easy a crisis like that can escalate. We've seen a very similar, if not almost identical story having now hit the fast food chains, and a similar sort of problem with their ice. So actually, when you think about how crisis preparedness can be put in place, knowing that they are in the food industry, and knowing that they're going to be dealing with similar processes in store, I think they could have learned from the mistakes of the coffee shops and actually been much more better prepared for the responses that they were going to be getting should an investigation take place in the fast food side of things.
One final point on this is about the social media response, which Gugs advised on, and the clients got the tone just right. So the messages, the tweets were along the lines of, we accept this wasn't our finest hour. They stayed true to their brand, whereas I think the other companies mentioned either just hid and didn't respond at all, or just didn't quite get it right. And I think the people, the followers, appreciated the stance that was taken in this particular case. There's quite a lot of detail on one crisis, but maybe it goes to validate a few of the points that we've made today.
Great. So it looks like that's all the time we have for today. If we didn't get your question, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually. So thank you all very much for joining today's webinar. And as mentioned at the start of the session, we'll send everyone an email with a link to today's presentation. We hope you enjoyed today's topic, and our next webinar in the series will be on search versus creativity, and will take place on August 15th. So to find out more and to register, visit our events page on our website at teamlewis.com. Thanks again, and we hope to see you next time.